Hey guys, so by now you've probably heard about Netflix's series Ancient Apocalypse. Maybe you've even watched it. It's produced and presented by this guy Graham Hancock, author of this book and many others, and it's exploring this idea of a lost ancient civilization that may have vanished in the cataclysm. And I actually really recommend this book, by the way. I don't agree with his conclusions, and I think he later revised his conclusions on this, but it's a really fascinating book, just the way that he writes like a seeker, and he takes you on this journey with him. It kind of reads like a novel or a mystery or something, and it's just, even though it's a big book, I got through it really quickly because it was just so fun to read. So I recommend that. Some of his other books I've liked a little less, some of them I've liked just as much. He's written a lot. But anyway, so he's got this series on Netflix now, and the mainstream legacy media, academia are all upset about it. And you might scratch your head and be like, what's the problem? Who cares whether or not people believe in Atlantis? Like, what difference does it make? But they're quite upset about it. And I came across this article in The Guardian, of all places. I'll link it in the description below. Lost city of Atlantis rises again to fuel a dangerous myth. What's so dangerous about it? Well, we're going to find out. The subtitle gives us a little bit of a clue. Millions have watched Netflix hit Ancient Apocalypse, which is just the latest interpretation of an enduring tale. But in its appeal to race science, it's more than merely controversial. So we get our first clue here as to what their objection is. But, I watched the show, I've read his books, and there's no mention of race in the show, so where are they getting this from? Let's go through the article. I'll kind of read it out and comment on it as we go. It's not long. Link in the description, as I said. So, for a story that was first told 2,300 years ago, it was probably actually told a lot earlier than that. It's just, Plato's account is the one that we have first recorded that has survived. So for a story that was first told 2,300 years ago, the myth of Atlantis has demonstrated a remarkable persistence over the millennia. Originally outlined by Plato, the tale of the rise of a great ancient civilization, followed by its cataclysmic destruction, has generated myriad interpretations. Many versions have been intriguing and entertaining, but none have been as controversial as its most recent outing in the Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse. Okay, well, controversial really just means something that the establishment left doesn't like. It doesn't actually mean it's controversial. It could even be an opinion that's held by the majority of people, but if they don't like it, they say, oh, controversial. Anyway. Presented by the author Graham Hancock, the program argues that a once sophisticated culture was destroyed by floods triggered by a giant comet which crashed on Earth, a disaster that inspired the legend of Atlantis, it is claimed. According to Hancock, survivors of the calamity spread around the world, which was then populated by simple hunter-gatherers, bringing them science, technology, agriculture, and monumental architecture. We owe everything to these near godlike individuals, it is claimed. I don't know that that's exactly what he's claiming. I wouldn't phrase it like that myself, but here's where we start to run into the problem that they have with this. It goes against the myth of linear progress, which is fundamental to the modern mindset. I won't get into that too much because it's kind of on a tangent somewhat. I have another stream on my channel about transhumanism, where I talk more in depth about that with my good friend Semiagog. And, this idea that humanity is, we were once primitive cavemen and now we've reached the apex of civilization. We are the most advanced humans ever to live. This is really foundational to the progressivist mentality. You can't have a progressive ideology if you don't believe that we're constantly making progress. Anyway, so for good measure, Hancock, who has been promoting these ideas in his books for decades, sounds like he's been doing a lot of research, if you ask me. I mean, somebody who's written that many books over decades, visited a lot of sites, he's obviously studied this. I don't believe that you need to have a university qualification to be qualified to speak on something. In many cases, having some kind of university or academic credential is often a sign of being very close-minded. So he argues that archaeologists have deliberately covered up this catastrophic vision of civilization spread, and accuses mainstream academia of its extremely defensive, arrogant, and patronizing attitudes. Well, I don't think he claims that they've deliberately covered it up, but he has said that they refuse to investigate it with any seriousness, which is true. And he also says, they won't address the questions that he's raised or even consider his hypotheses, also true. And they are extremely defensive, arrogant, and patronizing. Like, sorry guys, like, no lie detected. These stark claims have helped a series reach the top of viewing lists on both sides of the Atlantic, to the chagrin of archaeologists who, for their part, have denounced ancient apocalypse on the grounds that it provides little evidence to support its grandiose claims, and for promoting conspiracy theories dressed up as science. Okay, wow, there's a lot to unpack just in that paragraph. This is the way that journalists will write in order to, prime your mind to come to a certain conclusion. There's a lot of really charged language in this. Stark claims, chagrin of archaeologists, denounced, little evidence, grandiose claims, conspiracy theories dressed up as science. Wow, how much poisoning of the well can you fit into one paragraph? Apparently quite a bit. So the chagrin of archaeologists, I'm sorry, are we supposed to care how they feel? Maybe somebody is out there doing your job better than you. Get on top of these things. Go research it for yourself. Give us some evidence to believe your side of the story and not Mr. Hancock's, but they don't really want to do that. There is one guy on YouTube, I can't think of his name, somebody in the comments will probably know, who actually does engage with him in good faith. I don't agree with that guy's conclusions, but I appreciate the effort at a genuine conversation. So, grandiose claims. Yeah, they're big claims, but they're not any bigger than the claims that, out of Africa theory or evolution. It's like any time that you're going to come up with a hypothesis about something of such magnitude, I guess they're all grandiose claims, aren't they? Because it's a big deal. Conspiracy theories, it's just an alternative hypothesis, and one that you guys haven't managed to disprove. You haven't disproven it, so it still remains within the realm of possibilities. Dressed up as science, well, science, what is science? The scientific method involves, asking a question, forming a hypothesis, testing the hypothesis, and coming to a conclusion. So it seems to me like that's exactly what Graham Hancock has done. He has a question, he came up with a hypothesis, he's done some research, he's drawing conclusions from it. You don't have to be a scientist to do that. That's just the basic process of empirical reasoning. Anyway, Flint Dibble, what a name, poor guy. Flint Dibble, an archaeologist at Cardiff University, described Hancock's basic thesis as flawed thinking. Archaeologists don't hate him, as he claims. It is simply that we strongly believe he is wrong, says Dibble in an article in The Conversation last week. Okay, you simply believe he is wrong. Well, this is very typical of the leftist gatekeepers. You're wrong, but we won't tell you why. We won't address your questions. We won't show you how we got to a different answer. We'll just destroy your reputation. We'll call you a conspiracy theorist, a pseudoscientist, say you're peddling misinformation, all this stuff that they use to kind of avoid a real conversation about it. And, it's one thing to say, well, you're wrong, but if you're not even going to explain your position, you're not going to explain how you've disproven his theories, and you can't because you haven't, you can't really say he's wrong. No, this is not something that we can ever definitively prove. So it does remain within the realm of possibility that this could be true. This could be a theory. And I think that Hancock actually makes a reasonably strong case for his hypothesis here. And he's giving us his information, he's sharing his methodology, he's sharing his conclusions. Mainstream archaeology, anthropologists like, no, we disagree, you're wrong. And we're not going to tell you why. Get educated, you know. Get educated, but we're not going to tell you how. So it's just, I don't know. You guys probably can all, if I wasn't on camera, I'd have some choice words about that. But anyway, the confrontation is intriguing and raises many issues, of which the most basic is the simple question, why has the story of Atlantis, compared with other myths, maintained its popularity for so long? What is the essential attraction of the tale? It's cool. It's really cool. It's exciting. It's fertile ground for the imagination. And so of course it's going to stick around in the collective consciousness. You know, they say, for answers, we only have to look at the works of Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, H.P. Lovecraft, Conan Doyle, Brecht, and a host of other science fiction writers who have all found the myth an irresistible inspiration. Well, you know, there is something about it, mythologically, that resonates as true, on some level. And this is, you know, we can say this about all myths within our collective body of human stories. There's something about it that on some level contains some kind of truth. Maybe it's a metaphysical truth, maybe it's a historical truth, you know, who knows? But there's something there. So, of course, people are going to continue to be drawn to this because it's like, why wouldn't you be? Like, maybe I'm weird like that, but I think it's cool. As to the suggested location of this lost civilization, these have ranged from the Sahara to the Antarctic and countless places in between. You know, in regards to like all these locations, this is a question that people sometimes ask me about, because everybody has a different idea about where Atlantis was located. And, you know, my view is that Atlantis was an empire. It wasn't just one city. They had many cities. Even in Plato, it sounds like Atlantis was a colonial power, at least by the time of, you know, when Solon was hearing the story. Originally, you know, by the end of Atlantis, they had obviously degenerated into some kind of like warmongering imperial power, a naval power to be sure. So there's probably a number of locations in the world that were a host to this civilization at some point or another. So, nor is Hancock the first to suggest the destruction of a once great civilization led to the flowering of a culture elsewhere. In 1882, the maverick U.S. congressman and popular writer Ignatius Donnelly published Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, which argued that a highly complex, sophisticated culture had been wiped out by a flood 10,000 years ago and claimed that its survivors had spread around the world, teaching the rest of humanity the secrets of farming and architecture. Sounds familiar. Then there were the Nazis. Oh, the Nazis. Many swore by the idea that a white Nordic superior race, people of the purest blood, had come from Atlantis. As a result, Himmler set up an SS unit, the Ahnenerbe, or Bureau of Ancestral Heritage, in 1935 to find out where people from Atlantis had ended up after the deluge had destroyed their homeland. So, I'm like, okay, first of all, then there were the Nazis, you know. Well, of course, the Guardian is going to bring in the Nazis as their convenient scapegoat for everything, but the Nazis were hardly the first or the only people to believe in the myth of Atlantis and Hyperborea, or whatever you want to call it. This idea of like this mythical island or race, it goes all the way back to ancient times. It appears in many forms over and over. There are things that are highly symbolic about the disappearance of this primordial race, of the sinking of their island, or the island becomes invisible or something like that. Like there's just tons of Atlantis style myths out there that share in the same symbolism. You know, from my esoteric perspective, Atlantis was, you know, a later kind of descendant of Hyperborea. And you could maybe make the case that the descendants of Hyperborea, who were maybe the most pure in like biological race were the ones that came into Europe. But if you want to make the case for, well, who retained the pure spiritual race, you know, that probably goes to the Aryan Indians. So we have, and Hancock shows this in his documentary, a number of sites related to this solar cult of Atlantis all over the world. And we're talking about a really long time ago. I don't think it's helpful or even intelligent to talk about race in the way that we think of it today, the way that we categorize people today. It just isn't really something that applies to the story of Atlantis in that way. You know, there's maybe more we could say about that, but, you know, gotta be mindful of terms of service and all of that. So, and he goes on and says, and that in part explains why the myth of an ancient lost civilization is so useful. Okay, so the Nazis explain to us why it's useful. Okay, got it. It's a basic tale of a rise and fall that can be corralled and exploited for all sorts of causes. Plato meant his tale to be an allegory. Atlantis was Plato meant his tale to be an allegory. I mean, that's something that is in itself disputed. I think it probably was an allegory, but, you know, they're just stating this as if that's the only conclusion, and that's definitely not the only conclusion that people have come to. And Plato tends to have many layers to his writings. Some of them are allegorical layers, some of them are not. Anyway, Atlantis was destroyed by the gods who had grown angry with the hubris displayed by its inhabitants and so destroyed it. Don't get too big for your boots, in other words. Like this idea that it can be exploited for all sorts of causes. Like, you mean it undermines a lot of establishment narratives about race and human origins and progressivism? That's really what it sounds like to me. It's when they say, oh, it can be exploited for all sorts of causes. No, it's just like not something that you guys can use to shore up your own narratives and power structures. So anyway, but Hancock, who describes himself as a journalist, presumably to avoid being called a pseudoscience, no, actually he is a journalist. He calls himself an investigative journalist. He investigates things he has questions about. This actually makes him a very good journalist and is something that modern scientists could probably learn from. As I said, like, he's just taking the most basic scientific method and applying it to his interests. As opposed to, you know, taking grants from corporate interests to come up with the answers that are profitable for them. So he takes the story to a new controversial level, there's that word again, in suggesting that survivors of such a deluge were the instigators of the great works of other civilizations, from Egypt to Mexico and Turkey to Indonesia. Okay, like, your narrative of this being a white supremacist theory is now falling apart. As Dibble states, such claims reinforce white supremacist ideas. They strip indigenous people of their rich heritage and instead give credit to aliens or white people. In short, the series promotes ideas of race science that are outdated and long debunked. Okay, so first of all, Hancock never mentions race. I've never heard him mention race. If anything, he's a liberal and appears to believe in the myth of the noble savage to a great degree. Like, I'm not sure where you get an agenda of racial supremacy from a guy who's visiting all these sites in Asia, South America, Middle East, everywhere, right? Is it because of the myth of the white gods being related to Atlantis? Because as far as I'm aware, he has never claimed that these white gods have anything to do with modern day European descended humans. And as I said, I don't think it's helpful to even think about race in these terms when we're talking about Atlantis. it's just simply not relevant in that way. But this idea, oh, he's stripping indigenous people of their rich heritage. Well, isn't this the collective heritage of all of humanity? The way that he's presenting it, it seems like it is. So this is probably another case of like white people being offended on behalf of brown people. You know, I don't hear any of these people complaining that their heritage is being stripped away from them. It's like they're the custodians of these sites and these traditions now. Like this is their heritage too. So that just sounds ridiculous. The ideas of race science that are outdated and long since debunked. Well, that's also not true. Again, this is the left being like, our conclusion is the only conclusion. We've decided we are the ultimate arbiters of truth, and once we have come to a decision on what that truth is, everything else is considered debunked, outdated, misinformation. We've heard it all before, you guys, and we're sick of it. So, as to the likely site of the original Atlantis, the serious money goes on the destruction of the Greek island of Santorini and its impact on Crete, and puts the blame on volcanic eruptions, not errant comets, as Hancock argues. Okay, that volcanic eruption does not explain pretty much everything that Graham Hancock presents as evidence. Like, it doesn't describe like the massive like water erosion in the northwestern US and parts of Canada. How would a volcanic explosion 1,000 years ago in Crete affect that? You know, Hancock is kind of looking at things from a very global perspective, and to just be like, oh, Plato was just referring to this volcanic eruption. And it's like, yeah, I don't think he was. Especially if you're going to make the claim earlier that, oh, Plato's account was just an allegory. It's like, well, was it an allegory, or was he referring to a volcanic eruption on Crete? Which is it? You contradicted yourself already in this article. In addition, while ancient apocalypse suggests that the destruction happened 12,000 years ago, that would be the Younger Dryas period, most proponents of the alternative view believe it occurred around 1630 BC when the island of Santorini exploded in one of the most violent volcanic events in human history. You know, that probably would have been a big catastrophe, and it would have definitely caused like, localized disasters, but it certainly doesn't explain how all of these megalithic sites around the world predate what archaeologists and anthropologists say is the beginning of human civilization in those areas. They're not even addressing anything of substance that Graham Hancock has said. This is just purely a smear piece, which is exactly what we'd expect from The Guardian. 14 cubic miles of rock were hurled into the atmosphere, triggering huge tsunamis and a hail of ash that would have destroyed the Minoan civilization, which then flourished in Crete. It was this cataclysm that was remembered more than 1,000 years later in Plato's time. As I said, like, they're contradicting themselves. First they say, oh, it was just an allegory, but now it's actually a historical event? Okay. Funny how that works when it suits you. He attributed it to a civilization called Atlantis, little knowing how his brief description of a lost culture would resonate so strongly and often controversially through the ages. Okay, tell me you haven't read this book without telling me you haven't read this book. So anyway, that's my thoughts on that. I've also found other ones as well, like archaeologists reveal the white supremacist nonsense behind Netflix Ancient Apocalypse. That's on some, I don't know, weird boing site. Independent, Netflix's Ancient Apocalypse is the best case for publicly funded TV yet. Oh no, guys, we have to control the narrative. It's a dangerous conspiracy theory. People might actually believe in this myth. And, they're going to come and they're going to say, oh, Atlantis is just a white supremacist myth. That's going to be their next step. And I find that really disingenuous and really disappointing, because it disappoints me in the same way when I think about how like the Spanish conquistadors just completely destroyed the existing civilizations when they came through Central and South America. There was no need for that level of destruction. That's part of our human heritage. It's part of our story. And, you know, we've lost so much already, and now they're trying to bury the truth even more. You know, I think the myth of Atlantis is appealing to, you know, it could be appealing to people of any race. Numerous races around the world could stake a claim to having an Atlantis site in their nations. They could theoretically claim, you know, descent from those people who built that. So anyway, I would really suggest watching the show, deciding for yourself, maybe pick up some of his books if you like the show. You know, the show is just kind of a nice introduction to his thoughts. The books obviously go a lot more in depth. I'm guessing the Guardian writer and other journalists like that have not actually read any of his books. I think he makes a compelling case, even if I don't always agree with the conclusions that he reaches. Like, for example, in Fingerprints of the Gods, he kind of tries to pinpoint Atlantis as being Antarctica. And for a number of reasons, I just don't think that's the case. He later kind of walked that back a bit. But I think it's really interesting how the mainstream narrative has suddenly got their panties in a twist over something that, at first glance, you know, I think that an average reasonable person would say seems pretty benign. Like, what's the harm in believing that? And then they come out and they're like, well, you're stealing indigenous heritage, you're using it to promote white supremacy, when Graham Hancock has never done any such thing. And you know, in my experience, the people who are often the most enthusiastic about the Atlantis myth these days tend to be like kind of lefty new agey types, who have gotten a lot of their information about Atlantis from, you know, the writings of the Theosophical Society, that are not necessarily, I guess, esoterically sound in my opinion. But people should be able to make up their own mind. And this, the fact that they want to squash this and to silence this and deprive all of us of the right to just simply ask questions about, like, where have we come from? What is our heritage? What's our spiritual heritage? Why don't they want us to know this? And I think it's something maybe much deeper, maybe even something, you know, that they're not even conscious of. But I don't think it's just about, oh, we don't want it used to promote white supremacy, which I've never seen anybody do. I've read up on Atlantis stuff for a long time, and that's really not something I've ever come across. I would say among people who would even identify that way, they tend to be incredibly dismissive of theories like Atlantis. So anyway, that's what I've got for you guys today. I hope you found that interesting. As I said, I'll put the link to that article in the description. I look forward to hearing your comments. Let me know if you've watched the show or if you've read any of Hancock's books, what you thought of it. As I said, I just personally find this really interesting stuff, and I'm not super attached to whether or not anybody else believes it or agrees with it. It's just, you know, even just from an imagination perspective, it's just a really fun topic. And, you know, you guys have asked for some Atlantis stuff, and so we'll kick it off with this. And, you know, if you guys have questions, maybe we can do more stuff like this in the future. Thanks, guys.